Tonight was especially bright. The crystal chandelier reflected the light on the table, making the wine glasses sparkle, and the candles created a cozy atmosphere. The entire house was prepared as if for the perfect family dinner. Everything looked as it always did, with the same exquisite precision as all of our previous gatherings. We sat at a large table where Thomas, my husband, seemed to be the center of attention, answering questions from colleagues, patting them on the shoulder, and making confident proclamations of his success. He was on a pedestal, and everyone around him marveled at his career. I, on the other hand, was in my role as always. I'm not just a wife. I'm the one who makes his house perfect and creates the right atmosphere. But this time, I knew for sure that this evening was my last. When Thomas offered to host a dinner for his coworkers, of course I agreed. He always threw such parties before asking for a promotion or a new position. I had prepared the perfect setting for him, as usual. Everything had to be perfect. I stood at the stove, cleaned, arranged the dishes and fresh flowers in vases. That was my obligation. His colleagues were seated at the table, smiles on their faces, drinking wine and discussing some important business, but no one knew that this evening was prepared for me in a different way than everyone was used to. At that moment, I already knew what I would serve for dinner. It would be not just a meal, but a symbol of my revenge. "You surprise me as always, my dear," Thomas said, raising his glass and smiling at me. "This house wouldn't be home without you." I smiled back, but it was an empty smile. Those words couldn't fool me anymore. He always said things like that to demonstrate what a wonderful accessory I was in his life. But what was behind those words? Not love, not acceptance, just a necessary addition to his public image. Me, his perfect wife who always supports him and makes everyone think how good we have it. No one knew that behind that facade was a whole other life. And now, standing in front of him with a smile on my lips, I realized that I could no longer be just a backdrop to his successes. I had prepared everything with love and attention to every detail. The roast lamb with rosemary potatoes was my idea, my work, my passion. What Thomas didn't know was that I wasn't just working in the kitchen. At this point, I was working for myself as well. My name was associated with one big project at my job, and no one at this dinner knew that there were other accomplishments in this friendly hostess life. I was a marketing director for a large company, but here, at this table, to everyone, I was just a wife. The wife who does everything to make him look successful. I had listened to his stories about his career and his successes, knowing his words were devoid of truth. But now I was silent, and only the look on his smiling face maintained the illusion that I was proud. "It's all her, guys," he continued, stroking my back again. "My wife, she makes our house, and everything is always perfect because of her efforts." I laughed, as I always did, and everyone loved my laugh. But really all I felt inside was an emptiness. I can't say it was a mistake, but it was definitely the moment when I realized that I didn't need to be that background anymore. I could no longer continue in that image. The evening was a major turning point for me. As soon as dinner moved into the usual stage of discussing work, I felt my strength leaving me. First the talk about new projects, then the stories about the salaries and bonuses Thomas received because of his successes. He always talked about his work as an important mission, where every success was his personal victory, and I was the one who held it all together, but stayed in the shadows. It became increasingly obvious to me that I had lived too many years hiding my ambitions and suppressing my own accomplishments for Thomas to shine. I could no longer be just his auxiliary sitting in the background. Rick, one of his co-workers, still the same man who never missed a chance for a joke at my expense, began discussing my work, and as usual, downplayed its importance. He continued, as if laughing, "You know, Alexandra, you must be truly lucky. My wife can't even do something basic in the kitchen." Everyone laughed, and I continued to sit with a smile on my face as I served the food. But what really pricked me was the look, I caught in the eyes of one of my co-workers' wives, Christina. I was ready to put that part aside, but she was familiar with what I was feeling. There was more than sympathy in her gaze. It was a sign that she understood. It became clear to me that I couldn't continue to remain silent, to play along with his jokes. Today, in this moment, I decided that my plan would no longer be just a fantasy. It would become a reality. I stood there, continuing to clear the table, but my resolve grew stronger and stronger inside me. The moment Thomas with another joke about how making money is so easy, I walked up to him and quietly said, "Actually, I've already advanced, Thomas. I was recently promoted. I'm now a senior marketing director." The silence that followed those words seemed to break. He fell silent. Everyone at the table stalled for a second too, but all I noticed in his eyes was bewilderment. He clearly hadn't expected me to start talking about my work after all. In fact, it was a shock to him. He couldn't even realize that I wasn't who he thought I was. He smiled, as if through force, and quickly added, "Yes, of course. It's not a hard job for you at all, is it? You're certainly up to it." It was so obvious that he himself didn't realize how demeaning his words sounded. I only nodded, restraining myself. I realized he wouldn't appreciate it, but I didn't care. In that moment, I felt the power and strength building up inside me. I was no longer just his wife. I was a woman who was doing it all her own way, and she was ready to take matters into her own hands. After I said those words, I felt new somehow. Everything I had done before was for him, for his success. But in that moment, when he just stayed silent and went back to his coworkers, something inside of me fractured. I no longer wanted to be a part of his world where I was just a background. I continued to pick up the plates, but the next step, the next plan was running through my mind. He didn't know that in that moment, while his eyes were glistening with pride in himself, I had been preparing my own roadmap for a long time, and I didn't need his approval or his acknowledgement. As the guests began to reach for dessert, I felt the energy suddenly return. I wasn't just the woman serving the guests. I was a person in control of my life. I went to the kitchen where a chocolate soufflé was prepared, a dessert I had made myself as the finishing touch to the night. The serving was impeccable, and I brought it into the dining room with a smile but completely calm. I felt like tonight's game was no longer about him, but about me. As I served dessert, I noticed how the guests began to genuinely enjoy the evening, while Thomas, oblivious to everything, continued to play his role as a successful businessman. Everyone was praising the food and the decor, but something had changed in the way I was feeling. It was then, in that moment, that I realized I would never go back to this as my past. In that moment, I made a decision. My plan was already formed. My actions had become so clear and decisive that there was no doubt in my mind that the evening would end very differently than everyone expected. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Despite the late night, I felt something strong boiling inside me, something that could no longer be held back. That night, I filed the paperwork that would change my life. It wasn't just a form, it was a decision I had made. I was no longer willing to be just a convenient part of his success, his manipulation. I couldn't allow myself to continue to be humiliated. Thomas was still asleep, rolling over in bed. His face was as calm as a child's, almost defenseless. At this point, I probably could have still pretended to enjoy it, but I couldn't. I felt a new strength within me, a strength that came with every step taken toward freedom. It was almost peaceful to realize that I was on my way to something new, albeit difficult, but necessary. I got out of bed and quickly went to the bathroom. In the mirror, I saw myself, no longer the woman who was ready to please and forgive. I saw a woman who had freed herself from years of pressure and was now choosing her own path. My gaze was determined. I almost didn't notice how that look had become my constant companion. I wasn't going to put up with his attitude anymore, with the fact that I was just a part of his life and not his equal. When I returned to the bedroom, Thomas was still asleep, unaware that the evening I had prepared for him would be his last. A memory flashed through my mind of how he had once told me that we shouldn't look for big meanings in our lives, that we just live for pleasure and simple joys. I felt no joy in what he was saying, only indifference that had been building up for years. Everything I'd done lately had been for him. Now I had to do something for myself. I walked to the kitchen where the fog in my head was slowly beginning to fade. I was still doing what seemed to be the norm, making coffee and cooking breakfast. But this time was different. I knew this morning was the beginning of something important. I had taken a crucial step that night, and today I was going to keep moving forward. I felt not only anger come out from within me, but a sense of release. I was ready to face myself and keep going, no matter what came next. When Thomas woke up, I had already finished breakfast. Everything was ready: fresh coffee, eggs, toasted toast, but his customary thank you didn't move me. I knew it would be taken for granted, not worthy of attention. He just took it for granted, like he always did. And I realized it was time for me to move on from it. He kept talking as if nothing had happened, as if everything I'd done was just an obligation. We sat at the table and he kept talking about his plans for the next month, about how he would have to present his team on a new project, how he was going to advance his career. He always talked about himself as if he already owned everything, and I was just an insignificant detail. I listened to him, but I didn't take it in. I could feel his words becoming empty and his ambitions becoming distant and alien. He said we would have a change when we moved into a new house and started a new life, but I didn't believe any of his promises. None of his stories hurt me more. I sat there silent, sipping my coffee, and I couldn't believe how long I'd let him play this role. The role of the successful man who always makes decisions, who always leads. He never gave a second thought to how I was feeling. He never saw me, never felt me. And I felt a mixture of disappointment and determination overwhelm me. There would be no more parties, no more dinners where I would sit, smiling and content, listening to his praise and humiliation. When I finally broke the silence and calmly told him I couldn't stay with him, I noticed his surprise. His face immediately turned stony. It was like a restrained rage. He couldn't understand what had happened. He knew me, but he didn't know that I might have made a move that I had never talked about. I was no longer his pet decoration. I was a person ready for a change. Thomas was shocked. He hadn't expected me to be so determined. He knew me too well to believe that I would just let things go. We spent a few minutes in silence, but his eyes were full of bewilderment and rage. He was trying to find an explanation for what was happening, but I wasn't going to explain. All I could do was stand there and stare at him, feeling no pity. "You can't just walk away like that," he said finally, his voice sounding as if he was trying to make me believe his own words. "We have everything perfect. We're building a career. We have a house, friends. You can't just pick up and leave it all." I met his gaze. I no longer felt attached to this house, to this life, to this role. I was no longer willing to hide my dreams and ambitions to please him. All these years I had been pulling this weight. Every day I found myself in the shadow of his successes, taking on the role of a faceless wife who only accompanies but is not entitled to her own opinion. "I can't be in this anymore. I can't keep playing the role you've created for me," I said, my words sounding confident, even though my heart was racing in my chest. I knew it was a decision that required strength, but I was willing to go through with it. His face contorted with anger, and I could feel the calm growing inside me. I didn't need his approval anymore. He tried to get my attention by exclaiming that I didn't realize what I was losing, that I needed to leave all my ambitions behind and be with him. He talked about business, about our future. But I couldn't listen anymore. I had already made my decision, and all I felt was relief, as if the mountains I'd carried on my shoulders all these years were finally crumbling. You don't understand. It's not just about you, I added, standing with my head held up proudly. He looked at me like I was a stranger, and I could feel his words losing all meaning to me. You always thought I was just part of your image, that I couldn't do anything without you, but I proved to you that I can. I'm going to live my life, not yours. Thomas fell silent. He was trying to find the words, but he didn't know what to say. I saw something new in his eyes, not just anger, but fear. Fear that he was losing control. All this time he'd been trying to control me, and now I'd taken the power into my own hands. And that was the only thing I really wanted. I wasn't ready to be a part of his world anymore. In that moment, I felt like I was standing on the threshold of a new life, a new power, and this was just the beginning. I quietly walked out of the kitchen, leaving him sitting at the table, still not realizing what had happened. He kept lying to himself, hoping I'd come back, but I couldn't go back to that world anymore, a world where I was just a support for his career successes, a world where my accomplishments didn't matter. I picked up my phone, and without thinking, I sent a text message to my lawyer. It was short, but to the point. Let's move on. Everything is ready. The reply didn't take long. The documents are ready. We'll meet tomorrow at 9 a.m. My heart sped up. I knew it was the end of everything that bound me to this house, to this life. All I had to do was take the next step. I felt the determination ignite inside me again. The thought of divorce, which I had put off for so long, now seemed right. I went to the bedroom where my clothes, my symbol of independence, remained. In that moment, I realized that all these years, Thomas had not been a husband to me, but just a man who had tried to destroy my identity, and now I was ready to be free. I quickly packed my things and put them in my bag. All this time, I had been silent, but now that I was making a decision, I felt my power become invisible, but powerful. When I returned to the hall, I was no longer the person he knew. I simply said, "I'll leave. Don't worry about household matters. I'll take care of everything myself." I left him shocked, and despite his attempts to stop me, I couldn't go back. I had put everything behind me. Everything that had come before had become a part of the past, and I was ready to face the future. The morning, like all the mornings before, began with a slight sense of anxiety. Everything was prepared for the next step, and despite the sudden release from Tom, I felt that this new phase of my life was not just an act of revenge or liberation. It was more than that. My look in the UI mirror showed a confident woman, but in truth there were still traces inside of what I had hidden for so long: hurt, resentment, mistrust. I quickly got ready, put on a strict business suit that always reminded me that I was more than just a stay-at-home wife. The suit was like armor, a reminder to myself of who I was before Tom and who I became after. As I buttoned the button on my shirt, I felt a strength inside me that I hadn't felt before. This woman standing in front of the mirror was ready for any turn of events. Last night was not just the beginning of a new phase for me, but a moment when I realized there would be no more of these faceless evenings where I played the role of the perfect wife supporting my husband's career. I stood in front of the mirror and exhaled, feeling the tension slowly drain from my body. This week that I had spent preparing my revenge, preparing myself, for this moment now felt like one of the most important times in my life. As I put my cup of coffee on the table, I thought that there was no more room for regret and fear in my life. I was ready to embark on a new path, and that path didn't involve staying close to a man who had once been everything to me, but was now just a reminder of how much I had lost trying to make his world perfect. But now I knew his world would no longer be mine. The phone rang. It was my lawyer, Diane, who was already on top of things. I knew that after talking to her, I no longer had to worry about Tom, about his reactions, about how he would try to manipulate the situation. I answered and took my time listening to her calm and confident voice that had always been a support for me. Diane had already prepared the paperwork and everything was on its way to finalizing this cycle. I got in my car and headed to the office where my meeting with Diane was waiting for me. My mind was spinning with thoughts of how Toma would change this moment. I knew he would try anything to regain control, but I didn't care. I was willing to stand my ground and not let him manipulate my decisions. Diane met me in her office, as always, with a professional smile and a confident look. She motioned for me to sit down, and I immediately felt the tension ease a bit. Did you know that every step in the divorce process can be crucial? Diane and I had gone over each moment in detail, and I now realized that all I had to do was take the final step. I've prepared all the paperwork as we planned, Diane began, opening the folder of papers in front of me. This evidence of Tom's financial improprieties is our biggest bargaining chip. You were right to start tracking his transactions. This evidence will make the case much easier. I nodded, feeling the calm inside me return. Diana had said all the right things. I hadn't expected it to be so easy, but I'd never doubted her abilities. We had prepared thoroughly, and now we just had to act. I told Diane about my conversation with Tom yesterday and how he had tried to talk me out of this move. He was shocked, of course. He'd always thought I was weak, and even now, when I was on the brink of freedom, he couldn't believe I would do it. "You made the right move," Diana said when I finished my story. "It's time to act. We're filing for divorce, and he won't be able to stop it. And as far as his company is concerned, I've already received information about his violations. They could be serious." Her words warmed me like never before. I had been ready to face reality for a long time, but now I knew that my power was not only to break free from his world, but to recreate my life, building it on my own terms. I could feel this liberation lifting me ever higher. My decision I made was a step I could be proud of. As we wrapped up the meeting, I felt a confidence that was unfamiliar to me. I walked down the street feeling the light breeze fluttering my hair. In that moment, I realized that I was no longer afraid. I was ready for a new life, full of the opportunities I had given myself. A few days had passed since I had made my final decision. The waiting and preparation was over, and now it was time to act. I knew Thomas would look for ways to bring me back, but I wasn't going to let him take control again this time. This was my life, and I had to build it. His words still rang in my head, his endless promises, but I knew for sure now that this whole game was over. All the years I'd spent with him hadn't gone to waste. They had become a springboard for me. All that I'd been through, all that humiliation and manipulation, I'd been able to turn it into a strength that told me to go forward. I went back to my office, back to my job, and I finally felt everything go back to normal. This time, I was no longer just a successful man's wife. I was a woman who was respected for her accomplishments, for her ability to handle adversity. My work in marketing had long ago given me confidence, and now I was ready to use it to build my own career. Diane helped me every step of the way, advising me on all legal matters, but it was my determination that drove me. I met with my peers and was able to confirm my position as senior marketing director. But this success wasn't just professional, it was a personal victory for me. I felt my life change more and more each day as I regained control. The day I signed the final divorce papers, I didn't feel bitter. I just felt liberation. It was the end and the new beginning I needed. I was no longer just a wife sitting at home. I became a woman who decides how to structure her own life. The divorce process was quicker than I expected. I didn't think it would go so smoothly, but thanks to Diane and my own efforts, everything went smoothly. Thomas, predictably, tried to resist, but his financial machinations, which I'd carefully monitored, played their part. Diana was confident that his attempts to delay the process would not succeed. The divorce process was finalized, and now I was facing a new reality. Everything I had experienced now seemed like a lesson I had learned. I knew that this period in my life, full of doubt and fear, was now over, and there was only freedom ahead. There was no going back for me. Everything I had built up to this point, I had now left behind. The image I had created for Tom was no longer mine. I was me. Diane continued to help me every step of the way, but no longer as a lawyer, but as someone who believed in me. I felt her support, and it strengthened me. Our meetings became less and less formal and more friendly. We talked a lot about the future, and she even offered me some ideas for businesses that could be part of my new life. I was ready to take on new projects, new challenges, and every day I felt my options expanding. Even though I had been through some very painful moments, I was ready to move forward without looking back. I could no longer be a part of the world Thomas had built. I didn't want him anymore. This wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was an act of release, an act of giving back to myself. The day I signed the papers and felt my life change, I truly realized I was no longer afraid. Every step I took was now taken consciously. I was choosing my path, and nothing could stop me. No threats, no attempts at manipulation could influence me. I had freed myself from all those shackles, and that was just the beginning. My life, my career, my dreams. Now I could build it all without any restrictions. Thomas kept making attempts to win me back. I didn't expect him to be so persistent, but his persistence became something strange, almost desperate. He didn't want to admit that it was over, that I had finally made a decision that was long overdue. A few weeks passed after the divorce, and I felt that all his attempts to win me back were becoming more and more blatant and even obnoxious. He started calling me, sending me texts, but I ignored them. His behavior was devoid of any logic, but I couldn't help but notice that he was deeply shocked that I left so easily. At one point, while I was in a meeting with new clients, I got a call from my sister, Megan. Her voice was excited, and she informed me that Thomas had tried to get to my house more than once, and had once even told her that I was his only mistake, and that his life was falling apart without me. I was relieved. He continued to self-destruct, and I was glad I didn't go back to those old patterns of behavior. It was like reliving that moment when I took a step toward my new life, and Thomas was still in the one I was leaving. Then there was another message, and there was something in it that touched me. I was wrong. I know you deserve better. Maybe I can prove that I can change. And I realized those words weren't about getting me back. They were about regaining his control, his power. He wasn't ready to part with what I owned, what I meant to him. He knew I had a choice now, and that scared him. Watching the screen, I realized that his requests weren't an apology. It wasn't a desire for a fresh start. It was just another manifestation of his selfishness. He didn't want to let me go because he was attached to me as a convenient object. I couldn't be that object anymore. The next day, I went to see my lawyer. Diane was convinced that I needed to decisively cut off all contact with Thomas so as not to give him any more chances to interfere in my life. We talked, and she offered me a strategy that was far more effective than I had realized. "You need to cut all the strings completely," she said. "A lack of response from your side is your best response. A written notice stating that no attempt to repair the relationship will matter. He needs to realize what he has lost." I looked at her and felt a certainty come from within. I had already made my decision, but now I realized that this step wasn't just a formality. It was my freedom. Freedom from what had come before. Freedom from all his manipulation, from his control, from everything he'd tried to impose on me over the last few years. "I'll do it," I said, feeling every letter of those words backed by an inner resolve. This is the end of it. Diana nodded and began preparing all the necessary paperwork. After she finalized the paperwork, I signed the documents that gave me full control over my life and my assets. I felt how every step I took in the process reinforced my new understanding of who I was supposed to be. I was no longer a weak, dependent woman. I was a woman who could make choices for herself. After I left the office, it was clear to me that every new day would be different. I didn't wait for his calls. I didn't wait for an apology or an attempt to explain why things happened the way they did. My inner peace was so strong that I couldn't allow its destruction to re-enter my life. After I signed all the papers and finalized the legal side of things, it was time for the final step. I decided that I needed to set up one last meeting with Thomas. This was not done out of a sense of revenge. It was necessary to end this chapter in my life. I didn't want there to be any unfinished business, any buts. I had to face him, explain that it was over, and regain control of the last element he had once tried to take from me. I contacted him and arranged to meet him at that cafe where we often had business meetings, the place where our life together had once begun. At first, when I chose this place, it seemed like the perfect fit. But now, looking back on my decision, I realized it was the best way to leave everything behind. We met at a table in the corner where we had once discussed future plans, not realizing that this moment, this meeting, would be the end of something much more important. Thomas sat across from me, confident as ever, but his gaze was wary. I knew he was still hoping for some kind of change, but I was no longer the same. I was ready to tell him everything I couldn't say before, to tell him what he needed to hear. "You do realize it's over," I began calmly, looking into his eyes. "I don't want to go back. I've chosen my path, and it's not your world. We can't go on." He tried to answer, but his words were unconvincing. He didn't realize what he had lost. He tried to somehow justify his actions, which I hadn't seen the point of in a long time, but I wasn't going to listen to him anymore. This wasn't a conversation about what was, but about what would be. I said we needed to go our separate ways. This conversation was just a formality. It ended everything that was between us. "I know this is hard for you to understand," I added, "but for me, it's the right decision. I can't be a part of your world again." Thomas was silent. He couldn't believe what I was saying, but I realized that this meeting wasn't for him to understand anything. It was for me to free myself from the last piece that was holding me back in the past. After our meeting, I felt like things had gotten better inside of me. It felt like I had finally gotten rid of whatever was pulling me down, whatever was keeping me from moving forward. There was no longer any connection to what I was leaving behind. I returned home and felt the walls become mine again. This house that was once connected to Thomas was now my space. Everything I had done and all the decisions I had made now made sense. I was no longer his wife. I was a free woman who could build her life according to her own rules. After freeing myself from that weighty past, I decided that I needed to rediscover my life. I started my business, which became an important part of my life that I had dreamed of even before I met Thomas. I realized that this process was not about revenge or punishing him. It was a journey of liberation for myself. My career, my relationships, my interests, all became more important to me than ever. A few weeks went by, and I felt like everything was falling into place. I was working, building relationships with coworkers and partners, and I could feel my life becoming more meaningful and joyful. I had found my independence. It wasn't given to me by anyone. I chose it myself. I began to receive offers of cooperation and new projects. I decided that it was time to move on, to discover something new and, perhaps, to start something that I would never have been able to realize if I had stayed. In my old life, I wasn't afraid. I knew that I was now in complete control of my destiny. It had been several months since I was finally free of Tom, and my life was filled with new possibilities. I couldn't believe how quickly things had changed. Once I was in my own home, without the constant accusations and manipulation from him, I began to feel more confident than ever. I pursued my projects, expanded my horizons, and realized that I could be successful without him. Everything that had been associated with him, with his expectations and demands, was gone. But one thing still bothered me. He wasn't the only one trying to control my life. Instead of relaxing, I was becoming more and more aware of how much more there was to come. My work began to give me more and more satisfaction. I got a taste of true independence and began to build the career that was most important to me. But in this process, I realized that I needed to find support among people who truly shared my values and desires. In parallel with growing my business, I was discovering a new understanding of myself. It wasn't just internal changes. I saw how respect for me was growing and how, through my efforts, my true strengths were beginning to emerge. This was important not only for my career, but for me as a person. One evening, after another productive week, I received a message. It was a request for collaboration from one of my old partners. He was on the lookout for a new consultant, and I was his prime candidate. I could feel my time had come. There was no doubt in my mind that I should take this project. It was a new stage, and I was ready for it. I felt good that people were starting to pay attention to me. That feeling was far more important than any old memories of Tom. He could no longer influence my decisions. I was completely on my own path, and nothing could stop me. The anticipation of the end of my old life, of what I had left behind, wasn't about regret. It was a release, a real release. As I embarked on a new project, I felt something important being built. This project was the first step in reclaiming all that I had once missed. I wasn't afraid of competition. I wasn't afraid of challenges. I knew I could do it. I was able to make a lot of contacts, and this job allowed me to utilize all the skills and knowledge I had gained during my years with Tom. Every step was now my own choice. And in this process, I felt supported by new colleagues and partners who saw me as a strong and competent person, not just a wife or a woman whose life was under control. I felt myself changing not only on a professional level. I became more confident in myself, in my body, in my mind. It was a real moment of self-acceptance like never before. My inner feelings became clearer, and I realized that I could be exactly the person I had always wanted to be. For many years, I had been blindly loyal to the dream of marital happiness built on other people's demands and views. But now I realized that this image was never mine. I was making my own path, and in that path, I no longer needed to justify my decisions to anyone. My life was my own now. I was finally free of all the shackles that bound me to past illusions. Everything that seemed important was now just a shadow of what I really valued. It was pure freedom. My efforts began to bear fruit much faster than I had expected. The project I took on was not only successful, but it became a jumping-off point for a host of new opportunities. My reputation in the business started to grow, and I could feel confidence becoming part of my new self. It was an amazing feeling to feel that you were finally where you belonged, that your value was no longer defined by someone else, but only by you. New opportunities came one after another, and with each new offer, I felt more needed and more important. I was meeting with potential clients, signing contracts, and it was all starting to come together into the perfect puzzle. But more importantly, I began to find my place not only in my professional life, but in a life that was free of all the shackles that had once held me back. I had to make hard choices about how to divide my time between my work and personal life. My days were now full of events, meetings, and negotiations, and I noticed that the more I put into my work, the more energy I had for other important things. It was all becoming part of the new me, and I wasn't going to stop. Suddenly, one encounter made an impression on me that I didn't expect. It was with a woman who ran a successful consulting business. She was bold, determined, and confident, and I realized I wanted to be like her. She told me about her journey and how she was able to build her business despite all the challenges. This meeting was an important lesson for me. I realized that you can move forward without looking back, and that success depends on how much you believe in yourself. Now I was ready to share my knowledge and experience with others, to help those who were on the threshold of change, as I had once needed help and support. I began to look for ways to continue to grow, to continue to evolve, and to help others evolve with me. Each day my life became brighter and brighter, and I was no longer the person I once was associated with Toma. I was now confident in myself and my abilities. But despite all these achievements, I realized that what was important to me was not only my professional development, but also my personal relationships, which I could now build on completely different foundations. After I gained this independence, it became easier for me to build new relationships. I met some interesting people, but I was still cautious. I realized that I wasn't ready to get into a serious relationship again just yet. But there were moments when I realized that opening up again was another step to continue my journey. One day, after meeting with coworkers, I met Daniel, a man who had started working in the same field as me. He was smart, reserved, and seemed incredibly interested in our shared work. We started chatting, and that communication was a new discovery for me. Not that I was looking for someone, but it was like meeting someone you could be yourself with, without too many preconceptions or expectations. We started spending more time together, discussing work issues, but with each new conversation, I felt something was changing. Daniel turned out to be the kind of man with whom I could build not just a partnership, but something more. Even though I was taking my time in this matter, it felt good to feel something new on the horizon that could be a part of my future. When I looked back at what had gone before in my life, it was obvious to me. Everything I had experienced had led me to be the person I had become. I felt that my life was complete, that I had gotten what I was looking for, freedom and the opportunity to be happy. New horizons were now opening up in front of me, and I was ready to step into the future. My life continued to gain momentum. My business was booming, and every day I felt my confidence growing. I was no longer the woman who once battled doubts and feelings of insecurity. I had become a person who was not only building a career, but creating my own destiny by my own rules. It was a few months after I had finally severed all ties with Thomas, and I was able to free myself from all the toxic attachments that had held me back for so long. It was a time of new beginnings. I could feel the space around me becoming bright and full of possibility. I needed to prove not to anyone, but to myself that I could be the person I dreamed of being. The business continued to do well, and I felt myself starting to make my way in a world that had become much more open to me. My new business marketing consulting project was a success, and the more I delved into my work, the more I felt I needed to keep moving forward, building my own empire. My relationships with my colleagues became even stronger, and I realized that I wasn't just working, but living, to become the best version of myself. But there was something more that surprised me. My success wasn't just about my career. It had become a part of myself. I realized that my accomplishments weren't just paper results. They were something that affected my inner state, my life. My business gained momentum, and now when I look back, I realize that what happened with Thomas was just a lesson, not destruction, but a step towards liberation. And the amazing thing was that I felt that I was stronger. I was no longer afraid. I no longer doubted myself. I knew that I could accomplish anything I wanted, and nothing scared me anymore. I realized more and more how important this stage in my life was. My self-esteem became solid, like a strong foundation that keeps what I'm building from crumbling. All those years spent in Thomas's shadow had taught me to see my capabilities, my worth. I was no longer dependent on being a part of someone else. I became a whole, independent, and strong person who makes her own destiny. Many new opportunities arose, and one day I received an offer from a large corporation that was looking for a partner to work on a global marketing strategy. It was a chance I couldn't pass up. The problem was that I wasn't ready to go back to my old life, although I realized that I was in a much better position now than I had once been. but meeting with the company representatives was not easy. I realized that this project could be a defining moment. Everything around me said that I was on the right track and now needed to step up, even if it meant facing new challenges. I felt it would take not only professional skill, but also confidence, like never before. When the appointment was set, I felt it was more than just a meeting. It was a moment that could be a turning point. I knew that I would need to use all my knowledge and skills to convince the partners that I was the right person for them. This was a chance not only professionally, but also personally. I could feel myself growing stronger every day, and I was ready to take on this challenge. The next morning, when I arrived for my meeting with the corporate representatives, I could feel the confidence starting to build inside of me. Everything I had experienced over the months, all the mistakes and successes, were now a part of me. And despite the gravity of the situation, I was ready. The meeting room was filled with people in strict suits, and they looked at me with interest, but also with a degree of wariness. I understood that it was normal. They had to see not only a professional, but also a person who could lead them to success. We started talking, and I immediately felt that I had changed significantly over the past year. I was no longer the woman Thomas had once manipulated. I had become myself. I felt like I was in complete control of the situation. Every word I spoke was backed with confidence. My professional side was in perfect order, and I knew I could do anything they asked. When the meeting was over, I didn't expect much anymore. I knew I had done my best, and I was no longer worried about how it would end. I went to my office to continue working on new projects, and a few hours later, I received confirmation. The offer had been accepted. I became their consultant, and this opened new horizons in front of me. After I signed the contract, I felt incredibly relieved. That moment was the culmination of all my efforts. It was the result I deserved, and I knew it was only the first step on the road to even greater success. My life now belonged to me. I was in control of my business, my career, my destiny. That evening, sitting in my office reviewing contracts, I suddenly stopped. Thoughts flashed through my mind of how much I had been through lately. These memories didn't bring pain. Instead, they were full of pride. I knew that I had survived everything I needed to survive to become a strong woman who could move forward regardless of the hardships. When I looked at my life now, I realized that it had become what it was meant to be. I am not afraid to be myself, not afraid to show my true desires and aspirations. I am finally free of the shackles that once held me in place. A call from Megan interrupted my thoughts. She congratulated me on my contract and suggested we meet the following weekend. It had been a while since we had seen each other, and I realized how important it was for me to have support in the form of people who understood me, not judging me, but simply loving and supporting me. Soon I met up with Megan at our favorite coffee shop. We sat over a cup of coffee and talked about everything, my progress and what was next. She was proud of me, and that brought me real joy. I realized that it's important to not only achieve your goals, but to have people around you who appreciate you for who you are. Thomas no longer came into my life. He wasn't a part of my world. And as I looked back, I realized that everything I had experienced was the fuel that ignited the spark of strength in me. I became the woman I'd always wanted to be, successful, independent, and full of confidence. Every day I grew stronger and stronger, and with each new step, I felt my life becoming more meaningful. I looked forward to the future with joy and gratitude for everything that had brought me here. I was free, and now I knew I could achieve anything I wanted, and most importantly, I was ready for whatever challenge the next day would bring.